Good morning to all of you. Good afternoon and good evening to those who are joining us online. Michael, thank you for that introduction. You spoke so quickly, so I'm going to go over some of the material. Well, my brain is works at a slower pace, so I'm going to go over just where we are as a means of setting the stage for a conversation between our distinguished guests. And we are extremely fortunate to have two rather extraordinary people. Of course, as everyone here knows, in Israel, many Israelis, or if not all Israelis, and many around the world remain deeply shocked by the attacks on the 7th of October. As Yuval Harari said, they were so reminiscent of the actions of the Einsatzgruppen in Ukraine in 1941 and beyond in Eastern Europe. They very much hit a particular nerve in Israel. The brutality of them was so shocking, and the fact that you still have a remaining 100 people, maybe slightly more, being held hostage, perpetuates the sense of trauma. For every day since, the Palestinians in Gaza have been living in a virtual hell with almost 25,000 people killed, and with the International Court of Justice opining only a few days ago that there's a plausible case for acts of genocide having been committed, but to be determined at a later date by either itself or a court that would hear a criminal proceeding. The situation now is that we have a expanding sense of the instability. We have attacks, as all of you know, down in the Red Sea on the part of the Houthis against marine shipping. We have a response by the UK and the US against Houthi targets. We have Iranian-backed militia attacking US assets and Israel responding as well. We've had assassinations to the north in Beirut, and we've had sparring by Hezbollah and with the Israeli forces in the north of the country south of Lebanon. We also have an inflamed situation in the West Bank with constant tensions that are bringing the situation to the boil. The general frame is also quite fixed for Israelis. The events start on the 7th of October. For Palestinians and others, it really begins much earlier, 56 years earlier, with the start of the military occupation after the Six-Day War was ended. That's the context in which they would view things, and much of the world sees it like that. And the settlement building, the imposition of the military occupation has created a sort of general context in which these tensions then come to the boil. The Palestinians very much yearn for their freedom from military occupation, and the Israelis very much yearn for a permanent security and want to be done with this endless feeling of insecurity in a world that is very difficult. There is, as Michael was saying, the hope now that there could be a breakthrough with a ceasefire that would be declared within a few days, one hopes, and the release of all the hostages, and this is being negotiated in Paris as we speak. And there are 2 to 3 peace initiatives that are being thought, or let's say peace initiatives may be too strong, 2 or 3 ideas that are emerging, which could also merge into one, of creating a sort of a pathway back to a peace negotiation. So with that setting of the frame, and I've probably left a few things out, and we'd be happy to, of course, answer the questions that you may have after the conclusion of the conversation. But the question I have for both our guests to start this discussion off, and perhaps if I can start with Omar, because traditionally he wants Mira to start, as I understand. So we're going to start with Omar. You've both spent 2 years together. You've traveled Israel and Palestine together. You've had extensive discussions, presumably privately, and of course in the public setting. Omar, what is it that you have learned from Mira that you as a Palestinian-American, or we as Arabs more generally, don't understand about Israel or the Israelis? I mean, what have you learned from this experience with Mira that you think would be helpful for Arabs to better understand?
So first of all, thank you so much for having us. We're really honored to be able to join you at Perry World House today. To answer the question you posed, sorry, I might start by saying that when Mira and I first made contact with each other, there was a period of feeling each other out. And part of our focus was trying to understand whether we had the same values, whether we came to the difficult questions that both of us have been grappling with for years, our respective careers, from a sense of with an array of similar political commitments. And I think Mira was apprehensive that I might be more of a compromiser than she hoped I would be. And similarly, I worried about the same with Mira, and she quickly reassured me that with regard to a commitment to equality, to mutual self-determination, that we were on the same page. But one of the things that I think drew me to collaborate with Mira was the fact that she grew up with, and continues to have, a strong and deep connection to Israel. And for me, what was interesting was for us to be able to kind of work through the difficult politics that we grapple with, not from a set of the same reactions to everything, but instead in light of that difference. And so one of the things that I have been learning, I think, over these couple of years is just how textured that Mira's emotional attachment to Israel is. And I think it's something that's not always appreciated. Of course, to some extent, I think for many Jews, and I think that this is true for you, tell me if I'm wrong, there is a sense of anxiety, a desire for refuge, a desire for the security that there is a safe place. And I think that many Palestinians and Arabs have a hard time understanding in view of our perception of how very disparate our power is in a range of different contexts. It's hard for us to appreciate that sense of fear and insecurity, which I've come to understand is deep and real and has to be engaged sincerely. But I think what I've also come to grapple with is that it's a range of other things. It's not just culture. It's not just Hebrew language. It's also how one is brought up. It's also feeling unmoored at a certain point in adolescence and finding in that place a different possibility, a possibility of escape and connection. And I think that as we try to chart a course forward, what we've got to come to terms with is the fact of profoundly deep and textured attachment on both sides, which shouldn't wipe away the asymmetries that we'll talk about and that you've already alluded to, but which should inform our idea of how to construct a better society there.
Yeah, Mira, the same question in reverse. I mean, so what do you think the Israelis are missing about the Arab perception?
Thank you, and thank you to being here and the wonderful hosting and your question. Just for the record, I'm not Israeli. I'm Jewish Canadian, but I did spend 3 years in my 20s, 3 separate years in my 20s in the 90s, now you can figure out how old I am, living in Israel and seriously considering becoming Israeli. And of course, that's something that is on offer to me. I can move there and become a citizen in that land in a way that Omar can't. So that's one thing that, of course, came more and more into relief as we've traveled there together. And I see the relative privilege that I hold going through the airport and Omar doesn't necessarily hold. There's always a fear that he'll be detained. Though, of course, now there's a fear that I'll be detained because of speech and the idea that the Israeli government is cracking down more on people that they view as dissenters. But to get to your question, first I just have to reply to a couple of things you said. You're right that I was worried that you were too much of a compromiser, but boy, was I wrong. So that's one thing I've learned recently, especially since October 7th, and we'll get to some of those tensions soon. And I love speaking Hebrew. And when I travel, I don't like speaking English. If I can avoid it, I love just trying my hand at various languages. I'm from Western Canada, not Quebec or even Ontario growing up, so my French is not as good as it should be for a Canadian. But if I'm in a French-speaking country, I like to try out my French. And my Arabic is not great, but I'm very enthusiastic. And I'll try Arabic, but ultimately it fails. And so if I'm speaking to a Palestinian citizen of Israel, and Omar and I in our travels have spoken to many, both informally, formally, through interviews, through our emerging podcasts, through the book we're writing, for the book we're writing. And sometimes if there's a moment in the conversation, I'll slip in a Hebrew phrase. Because I know that Palestinian citizens of Israel speak even better Hebrew than I do, and definitely better Arabic than I do. And they also tend to speak excellent English, but I'll want to try to create some sort of connection with one of our common languages that is not the language of the imperial power that has shaped all of our lives. And Omar told me one day after one of these interviews, can I give you some unsolicited advice? Which I had to say yes. And thank goodness I was wearing sunglasses. It was on a bus ride from central Tel Aviv back to Jaffa where we were staying. And Omar said, if you're trying to establish intimacy with a Palestinian, or a Palestinian citizen of Israel in this case, speaking Hebrew is not the way to do it. For them, Hebrew is a colonial language, and that's it. And that was sort of an awakening for me, because for me, culture is something intrinsically positive and intrinsically ranging from benign to positive, and I wasn't reading culture as political as I could have been, or perhaps should have been. And so I think that's it for now. Oh, there is one more important thing, and this isn't funny, despite my funny hand movements. I think from Omar, I've been able to appreciate what Palestinians see in everyday news images that I might not otherwise have appreciated to the same degree. That is when we see the internal displacement of 2 million out of 2.3 million Gazans. So nearly all Palestinians in Gaza have been displaced, have been forced to move from their homes. The IDF would say, well, we've had them move from their homes from the north to the south in order to protect them. Obviously, that hasn't been very successful with the enormous and unfathomable scale of death there. But when Palestinians view those images of other Palestinians walking southward along the road of death, as our friend in Gaza, Sarah, calls it, carrying all their worldly belongings, especially things like blankets and pillows, Palestinians see echoes of the Nakba. The average Jew, even someone like me who has devoted her professional life to studying it, isn't necessarily tuned into that because it isn't part of my internalized collective memory. And those have been very important associations to keep top of mind, and that now come quite naturally to me through our connection.
So what I understand from what you're saying is that your initial perspectives were very much determined by a sort of narrative that was accepted within the community in which you grew up, a sort of understanding of events, and which would be entirely normal, of course. And you've spoken to the fact that your association has now brought alive to you the fact that perspectives could be different. One assumes that when the events of October the 7th, triggered then this crisis, which has been, I'm scared to say colossal because we still could see something even more colossal, but a very significant crisis. Did you speak to each other right away? Did you confer? Were you not speaking to each other? Did it test you? Or explain to us how you then both grappled with this experience. Because to me it seemed fairly clear early on that there was a sort of tribalization of the pain. Each side was, so clearly on the Israeli side there was deep, deep pain, and then with every passing day that pain increased on the Palestinian side, and it was a case of, oh world, stand with me, I am in desperate pain and I need your support, and the same on the other side, and very little allowance to the fact that we should be feeling pain for everyone who suffers in any context, and not entirely always make it personal. But if you could walk us through those first few days and weeks, and I think you did mention to me that you were sort of sparring at some stage. Please. So let's start with you, Mira, and then we go to...
Okay, so I wasn't sleeping well for unrelated reasons the night between October 6th and October 7th. Unrelated, because how could I have known? So I did go onto my phone. It's not a good idea, but in this case, I was, I guess, glad I did. And the first image I saw of the news was a yellow gate, and it was in Haaretz, I guess, the Israeli news service. And I know those yellow gates very well, because those yellow gates are the gates that close off kibbutzim, agricultural villages. That's the Hebrew plural for kibbutz, kibbutzim, agricultural villages, from any outside people wanting to get in. And Omar and I had just visited my kibbutz family in July, so 3 months earlier. And Omar had, and I'll explain what a kibbutz family is for Jewish students who go on an overseas program. In my case, I was an exchange student at Hebrew University in my junior year. And I was assigned a kibbutz family. They were two parents around 40, and they had 3 young kids at the time. And we've retained a deep, deep closeness over the decades. And Omar had come to my kibbutz, and stayed with that kibbutz family in July. And he had slept in their secure room. And I saw the news. I immediately texted my kibbutz brother, who's now 40 himself, almost 40, and said, "Are your parents okay? What's going on over there?" And he said, "Yeah, they're fine, but they're traumatized." And now I knew something big had happened. Because when Omar slept in their secure room, that night, I slept in the room next door, and I heard a huge sound. It sounded like it was coming from your room, and I stopped myself from saying, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" Because I don't always need to, protect you. And the next morning, my kibbutz mom texted me, and she texted me with 2 things. The first thing she said was, "Hi, Mira," in Hebrew, reminder that you need to hang your laundry so that it has time to dry. And second of all, did you hear the rocket land near our house last night? So this is something that it turned out that the loud clang was a Hamas rocket that had been launched from Gaza. It landed about 300 meters from the house. And this is an everyday occurrence for them. So for my kibbutz brother to say my parents are traumatized, I knew something big had happened. So I found out more. I found out that they had narrowly escaped being taken hostage. They had been holed up in the secure room when they heard the rocket sirens, and then they heard Arabic right outside their house door. And when a kibbutz person hears Arabic, they assume the worst, and this is again part of the problem right now with potential coexistence in society. How are we going to get those languages, Hebrew and Arabic, to be understood and experienced in a benign and even positive cultural nurturing way? And this is part of the project we're involved in. And so I texted Omar and I said, bad things have happened in the south of Israel. Have you heard? Yonit and Ellie were narrowly escaped being taken hostage. Omar went on the news, and then all that morning we were commiserating and sharing our mutual grief for what had happened. So when you say that it was tribal, it wasn't tribal yet, because people like us were united in that moment. We were triaging. These are the people at this moment who require comfort and solace, and all eyes were on the victims and survivors of the massacre. Things soon changed, however.
Omar.
So in those during those first couple of days, I was naturally worried about Mira's kibbutz family, whom I had met, as she said. And that personal connection was transformative in a way, because something that might have seemed abstract felt real to me. But even at that juncture, I I said out loud how apprehensive I was about what was to come, about what Israel's response was. I was furious at Hamas because I knew the response that was coming. Anyone would understand the response that was coming. And so there was a lot of anger that I felt at that juncture, and that I expressed, among other things, on Facebook, eliciting a range of reactions from other Palestinians, including relatives who were saying, how can you express solidarity with them at a juncture when already hundreds of Palestinians have been killed. But I think it wasn't until a fair bit later that we started to run into some difficulty working through where there are gaps in perception of the credibility of sources, and even gaps in our reactions to things, which isn't even really about credibility. Let me tell you the story. So I was in France at my in-laws in December, and Mira texted me, middle of the night again, texting again, and she had just been fielding some difficult conversation on her Facebook page about the allegations of sexual violence on October 7th. She had posted the New York Times report about it, and some mutual acquaintances had been raising questions about the veracity of that report. So she reached out to me and said, "Oh, I'm so frustrated by this." And I wrote back with kind of a cringe emoticon, and then followed up saying, I'm so sorry you're dealing with this, but I have to say some of what I read in the New York Times piece also gave me pause. While I think that there was plausible evidence that sexual violence occurred, I felt that some of the specific stories that were recounted, first of all, seemed fantastical, and then secondly, and here's where the tribe comes into play. Secondly, I started to fear what stories of that kind would do to Israeli public opinion, the extent to which it would further inflame Israeli public opinion at a time when Israel was already engaged in this unforgiving assault on Gaza. And so I respond with this really complicated reaction. And Mira comes back at me.
And I respond with a very simple reaction. Like, basically, how could you? And anecdotal evidence, is that what we're calling survivor testimony now? And a few sources, is that what we call 150 reported sources who the New York Times reporters stated that they had interviewed? And I was fuming. At the same time, we haven't discussed this yet. I always save a few surprises for Omar at these talks. I think, looking back, I felt emboldened to unleash my anger at you because of a message you had sent me on Christmas Day. You look scared. On Christmas Day, neither of us are, well, you're a little bit Christian. Omar's a whole mix of things, and I'm decidedly not. I'm just through and through Jewish. Omar had texted me on Christmas Day saying, today is as good a day as any to tell you how much I appreciate working with you and how I wouldn't want to be processing the darkest day in the land of our common peoples with anyone else. And that touched me so deeply that it emboldened me to be angry at you. And it turned out to be an important moment because working through those emotions subsequently, we still haven't agreed on the degree to which the report should be trusted. We don't agree on that factually, or what's the word? We don't agree on the issue, but we've healed from the emotional fight we had. The fight got a little worse, and there may have been some name calling involved. But healing from that fight ended up, I think, strengthening our friendship and our working relationship, and enables us to know that if something like this happens again, we can get through it and there will be less fear and panic surrounding the actual issue.
If I could just add one thing, I know time is short. It's I think, part of the way that we've been learning to work through these questions together, these hard things, is first of all, looking inside and trying to understand what is fueling our respective reactions, where the emotion is coming from, and then with that in mind, going through and saying, okay, let's read the article together. What are the pieces where there actually is a difference about, and engaging in kind of a methodical discussion about where we may have different perceptions about sources.
And the next time we come together, it's really important. So this is where we're giving you our tried and true tips for when this happens to you and your friends and colleagues, to start with where you both agree, to start reaffirming your common values, which we'd spent a lot of time agreeing on initially. Where do we both agree in general? And that will create less panic over the areas where we disagree.
So you're both professors. You're both critically minded. You wouldn't be professors if you weren't. You're both obviously very self-aware, and you're empathetic, and you have compelling personalities. Listening to both of you, one would think, if we had a Middle East comprised of Miras and Omars, we would be optimistic about where we could go. And not to sort of cast or say anything which could even in the mildest sense be interpreted as negative, because people of faith, I would say maybe the majority of people on this planet are people of faith and people who have strong beliefs. But in the Middle East, there's a certain sort of rigidity in positions when you look at the communities on all sides, especially those who are more extreme in terms of their religious beliefs. Is there any hope that your accommodation for the view of the other can be scaled up? I mean, are we moving into such entrenched positions in the Middle East that it's unlikely we can sort of forge the sort of understanding that the two of you have been able to develop for each other? In other words, are you sort of almost exceptional? Or do you think that from what you've seen, and clearly most of it took place before the 7th of October, there are grounds for believing that there are many more people who are prone to think like this, even perhaps among religious communities. So let me put it another way. Are you exceptional and therefore we should be depressed? Or are you not so exceptional and we should be more hopeful?
We're a minority, but we're not unique. And Omar's the co-chair of an organization that I'll let him tell you about, and I'm on the steering committee of the American Friends of that same organization. And those are people who share our values and who have a plan for the future.
So the organization is called A Land for All, and I really encourage you to have a look at their website. What's exceptional about the organization is that it is thoroughly co-created, Jewish-Palestinian at all levels, Jewish-Palestinian co-directors, a board that has equal numbers of Jews and Palestinians from across Israel-Palestine. And the platform is something that has been that's been built together. And what strikes me as really worthy of hopefulness is that we had our first joint board meeting. Although the organization has been in existence for about a decade, the joint board was established in September of 2023. We had our first board meeting on October 10th. And you can imagine how polarizing that event could have been, that gathering could have been. But instead, what we found was that folks in that room were able to communicate sympathy and solidarity with each other, to redouble their efforts to commit with alacrity to trying even harder to do the work. And I think that part of that is about the fact that there had been a lot of time spent together through the years, and part of it is about shared values. But I would just add one thing, responding to your question. I think that there are many people whose hearts have become hardened on both sides, and I think that there are a range of different reasons for that, and violence, occupation, structural dynamics, and individual ones, of course. But I'm reminded of something that the former Palestinian Prime Minister Salam Fayyad said at a talk about a decade ago. He was talking about the wall that Israel has erected in the West Bank. And he said, in English you say, absence makes the heart grow fonder. He said, whereas in Arabic we say quite the opposite, that far from the eye, far from the heart. And he said, and I think we have it right. And the point he was making is a point that I think is crucial, which is that a regime of separation, of ethnic segregation, which has been the default for the last 20 years, makes it way harder rather than easier to mend fences, especially in a space as small as that, where we can't really avoid living in proximity, even if we're not living right beside each other. And so I think part of the solution is precisely what we've done, is more contact, more opportunities for people to interact, to share. I think that builds empathy.
So one final question from me, and then we'll go to the questions from the audience. Listening to both of you, one would anticipate that you've arrived at a shared vision for what peace would look like. Is that the case or not? I mean, are you both advocates of a two-state sort of settlement, the end of the military occupation, and the sort of variation of the sort of plans that we saw Camp David 2, where you were involved, Omar, and then subsequently Taba, and then more recently, about 10 years ago, a number of different ideas on territorial swaps and Jerusalem and so forth. So are you both of the same opinion of what peace would look like, or is there a discrepancy in your views?
I think that we are of the same mind, although it's been one of the things that's a product of our engagement with each other. So the movement that I spoke of, even though the name sounds like it might embrace a one-state solution, that what it stands for is something in between two states and one state. It's a two-state solution in the sense that it stands for the proposition that if a Palestinian state must be established alongside Israel so that there can be mutual self-determination. A state where Jews are a majority, a voting majority, a state where Palestinians are a voting majority. But what it anticipates is those two states being joined in a confederal union, one with a set of shared norms, some shared institutions, including a human rights court, and with freedom of movement and residence across that space, and the delinking of citizenship and residency to some extent as well, so that it's possible to find solutions to issues that have been really hard to resolve through the traditional two-state solution, including how you allocate sovereignty over the city of Jerusalem, what the solution would be for Palestinian refugees who seek to return to their homes inside Israel, and the solution for Israeli settlers who number now some 700,000 in the West Bank. And so what this approach allows is all of those issues to be addressed practically and creatively. And I think we're on the same page on that front, right?
Yeah, I mean, I spent many years being a columnist for Haaretz and a blogger at Daily Beast, and I was hard and fast adherent of the two-state solution. And so I tended to argue with people to my right and argue with people to my left. Then I became a one-stater. Then I met Omar, and he said, he's not really a one-stater. He's into this modified two-state solution. And that's when I said, what kind of Palestinian are you anyway? And then we had our, everyone was I was trying to be more Catholic than the Pope. Sorry for all these mix and match religious metaphors. But then I started watching the YouTube channel that features Omar. It's not your YouTube channel. He's not like I'm more narcissistic than he is. But there are a lot of videos if you want to watch Omar explaining these kinds of things. And one day I just listened. I listened very closely to Omar explaining a confederal solution to your international law colleagues. That was the forum that you were talking about it. And it just really made sense to me in a way that hadn't before. And so then I went back to American Friends of Land for All who had asked me to sign on to them. And why aren't you one of us? And I said, I'm a one-stater. And finally I went to them. I said, I'm one of you. How can I help? And we'll be in D.C., Washington, D.C. together in a couple of weeks, helping the co-executive directors make their case to the American public.
Well, so long as I'm the president of the Human Rights Courts, I'll subscribe to this way of thinking. The question I have from the audience takes us back to your original point, Mira. The first question is, why is compromise a bad word? The questioner says, I don't think it was meant in terms of compromising values. It was meant in compromising with those with whom we normally disagree. Isn't that a good thing? Something democracy needs, and how do we as academics help the media and those in public-facing capacities differentiate between legitimate resistance movements and actual terrorist organizations? Who's responsible for drawing these lines? Because as we know, they can lead to vastly different public perceptions.
I think that's at least two distinct questions, and so I'm going to start with the second. Terrorist organization is a political term. So different governments decide to brand a certain group a terrorist organization. But what isn't a political term, and as a political scientist, Michael, I think you'll maybe agree, I very much believe that the word terrorism is a word with a definition that can be applied consistently. It simply means targeting non-combatants for political ends. And that's what makes terrorism different from a garden variety serial killer in the streets of whatever big city you want to think about. Hamas used terrorist means on October 7th when they targeted civilians. When they targeted soldiers, that might not be called terrorism. That could be called anti-occupation resistance. Now, is it overall resistance? Sure. It could be considered resistance, but it was resistance with terrorist means. Terrorism means targeting non-combatants. So that's what I would say on that. What I would say about compromise, it's a really, really tough question. I think the idea with compromise is there are areas where people in a democracy or in an international order where two entities, a state and a non-state actor in this case, are trying to work out their respective needs, is you can compromise on material needs. It's a lot harder to compromise on fundamental rights and fundamental attributes of core identities. And so this is why for a long, long time I was a two-stater, because I said Israel is not going to and maybe shouldn't need to compromise on its core identity as a Jewish state. But then more and more I realized that core identity of a Jewish state in the way that Israel has defined it comes up against the rights of Palestinian refugees to return, and those rights are enshrined in international humanitarian law and other covenants. And Omar that's his area of expertise, and he can talk a bit about that. And so then I started thinking, how can you toggle back and forth between those identities? And there are ways, and for example, a confederal approach that would allow refugees to return, but still enable Israel to retain its core identity as a Jewish state. Creative minds need to be put to the challenge of compromising over material needs while maintaining people's fundamental core rights and identities.
I was just about to say we have no questions because I was going to come back with one. The questioner says, can you explain a little more about your idea for two states joined in confederation? How do Jerusalem and the right to return for Palestinians work in this scheme? So, Omar.
Sure. So, There's a lot of information on the website, so I really do encourage folks to look for A Land for All, to Google it. But the way in which the overarching framework would work in relation to Jerusalem is that it would be the capital of both states. There would be a clear border distinguishing the sovereignty of the Palestinian state from the sovereignty of Israel. But movement across that border would ultimately be free. There is an understanding that solutions of this kind are not implemented overnight. The contexts that are a model for this approach, the European Union, the Latin America Four Borders Control Agreement, the UK-Ireland Agreement, and Free Travel Zone, all of these spaces were spaces in which there was fairly recently conflict, and intense conflict. So it's not impossible to make a transition to a free movement regime from conflict, but we recognize, of course, that it takes time, that one has to undertake a phased implementation of that kind. So Jerusalem, that would be the framework. With regard to refugees and settlements, in a certain way, there is a parallel approach, which is not rooted in a parallel perception of the two groups, but recognition more broadly that for both Jews and for Palestinians, all of what we call Israel-Palestine, this one space is the same space, and it's a space that is cherished. Its length and breadth are cherished by both peoples. And so a Palestinian refugee who has been living in Lebanon, for example, for 2 generations, 3 generations, 4 generations, would be able to return and become a citizen of the state of Palestine, would be able to vote for the Palestinian National Assembly, Parliament, and at the same time would be able to become a permanent resident of the state of Israel, and live, for example, where my family comes from, in Jaffa, which was at one time the center of Palestinian life in Palestine, and is now sort of peripheral to Tel Aviv. There is A Land for All stands for the proposition that it's important to try to remedy past injustices, and so there is an interest in exploring means of dealing with restitution to the extent as possible, compensation as well. But attached to that principle is also the recognition that going forward one needs to remedy past injustice without creating new injustice. And so the question that we are focused on, among many others, as we undertake to sort of elaborate from a policy perspective on these ideas, is how do you create frameworks that allow Palestinian refugees to return to the places that they are attached to. I mean, my family has lived for hundreds of years in Jaffa. My great-great-great-great-great-grandfather met with Napoleon in 1800 to plead with him to show mercy to the people of Jaffa. So we have a long attachment to place, and what the movement stands for is the idea that it's possible to affirm, respect that without undertaking policies that would leave Jewish Israelis feeling vulnerable.
So the obvious question, which I'd like to follow up with, is that what you're proposing is, I mean, it speaks sense, right? It's it's almost highly cerebral. It's symmetrical. It sort of covers all bases. But we're dealing with 2 populations at the moment who are quite traumatized in almost a feral state as well. And it would be not wrong of us to say highly nationalistic. How do we get from where we are here in terms of, if that's the case, how do we get from that to the sort of a mental state which could be open to what it is that you're both proposing? Any ideas?
Sure. I would you like me to start? Okay. So without a doubt, it is difficult to get from where we are to a point at which this kind of framework can make sense, especially at a time when the current government of Israel is unwilling to countenance even a discussion of the kind of Palestinian state that President Trump was envisioning, right, on islands in the West Bank. So there's distance to travel. I think that there are a few ways in which we can begin the work now. So I'll just point to two, but I'd love to chat more about it. So first of all, I think that there has to be a robust international role on the ground in Israel-Palestine. We simply are not going to get to a better scenario if we, in light of the power disparity that's in place there, there is one actor that holds almost all of the cards, and in light of the enmity that you alluded to a moment ago, we are not going to get to this kind of vision unless there is a transitional administration with fairly significant power on the ground in the West Bank and Gaza Strip to ensure that we, number one, can begin rebuilding Palestinian government. Number two, that Palestinians and Israeli Jews alike are safe. And number three, that we can move toward a political process which we're simply not ready to get to now. Now, of course, there is as much difficulty with that concept in view of where the Biden administration is, for example, as with moving Israelis and Palestinians. But I worry that this horrible crisis is not even close to being over, and so I don't know where we'll be in a few months. So I think that that's one piece. And the second piece, which I'll just touch on briefly, is that, 75 years ago, at the conclusion of World War II, there was a recognition that if we were going to avoid the cycle that had twice embroiled the world in the worst wars of human history, that we needed to move from vengeance to a serious commitment to reconstruction. And I think that what's going to be really necessary in the couple of years ahead is a Marshall Plan for Palestine. I think it's not possible, not just because of the scale of what has happened in the Gaza Strip, but also because of the drift over the last 10 years. It's not possible to simply throw a few euros, because of course that's the expectation of where the money comes from all the time, here and there, and leave it at that. What is needed is transformation, and that kind of transformation requires a deep and sustained investment that includes not only a massive infusion of funds, but also a real commitment to building good governance in that framework.
Thank you, Omar. Mira, one more question, and then we'll have to sort of wrap it up. The audience member says, what role Hamas could or should have, if any, regarding planning a future that is safe for Palestinians and Israelis in current Israel and the current Palestinian territories and Gaza? I suppose that the broader question is that, again, looking at the more religious parts, I mean, even if the Hamas leadership were to be scattered by the Israeli military forces, you still have Islamists. What happens to their thinking, or similarly on the Israeli side, those who are deeply religious-minded? You're saying essentially that in this confederal type of arrangement, those who are ideological settlers will become Palestinian citizens, but with their rights protected by a human rights court. So what role for those who have deeply held religious beliefs and the ask of them is going to be let's say not considerable, but the distance to be traveled is going to be significant. And is this then going to be resolved through some sort of inter-religious dialogue? That could be, I mean, we will have to think of the precise way to get there. But the question is asking what role should Hamas, and I take that to mean really all the religious groups, if I can put it like that. Mira?
Sure. One just small correction. Settlers who would stay under a confederal solution in the West Bank wouldn't be citizens of Palestine. They would be residents of Palestine who have to obey the laws of the land, but they would retain their Israeli citizenship and vote for the Knesset in West Jerusalem. I think what we've seen with Hamas is that religion has been mobilized for political change. It's been mobilized into a language that speaks to many Palestinians who aren't necessarily, it speaks to even secular Palestinians, that Hamas is the group that has fought for Palestinian rights. The key is to enable everybody's rights to be protected and maintained and acquired insofar as rights are being actively denied currently. And then the politicization of religion will be less attractive to those who aren't already committed to an Islamist view or a religious Zionist view of the world.
May I add to that? I agree with what Mira said. I think that in the coming couple of years there's going to be a set of policy questions which will need to be addressed, including by governments like ours, about how you think about Palestinian governance and Palestinian democracy, and the extent to which an actor like Hamas will be permitted to participate in a internationally supervised process. To my mind, there is no alternative to engaging Palestinian Islamists. They are a part of the national consensus. Excluding them, I think, would be at the peril of the legitimacy of Palestinian government and would make it much, much harder to move toward a situation of security for Israelis and Palestinians alike. And so the question becomes, how do we engage them? How do we pull them in? I would stress two things. The first is that there are many who, and this is part of the point that Mira was making, really believe that Hamas and the Islamist movement has an important political role to play, social services role to play, without embracing terrorism. And to my mind, one of the things that we can do is to give support to those who would push the movement in that direction rather than trying to exclude Islamists entirely. So I think there needs to be a recognition of the ways in which this movement is plural and helping to kind of leverage that. And simultaneously, I think there needs to be a recognition that deep vulnerability, particularly to occupation and all that it involves, makes it very, very hard to make progress in dealing with demobilization of an organization like Hamas. I think the greater the extent to which there is a process in place that Palestinians feel will deliver an end to occupation, the way easier it is to build a governing coalition that marginalizes the most dangerous actors.
Well, with that, we've reached the end of the hour. I don't know about everyone in the audience, but for me, having been involved in so many discussions about the crisis, you leave us with a more hopeful tone and a feeling that perhaps something that is and hasn't been thought of, but is now, I think, a credible proposition, just listening to you off the top of my head, is perhaps fodder for optimism. So thank you so much, Omar and Mira, for joining us today. And may I ask the audience to offer a round of applause, please?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.